The $40,000 small SUV question. Last week we had the RAV4 TRD off-road, whereas this week we have the Mazda CX-5 Turbo Signature. Both are upper trim levels of their corresponding models, but the difference is the TRD off-road is more focused on off-road capability, where this Turbo Signature is all about on-road and having way more power and torque. Why would you buy one over the other? Well, that's what we're going to find out today by taking a look outside, inside. I'm going to show you some of the features and technology of this vehicle. We're going to try and cram a bike in the back to see how usable this hatchback is. And last but not least, we're going to take it out on the road to see what it's like to drive. This generation of CX-5 has been around for about 7 years now, so this styling is not exactly anything new and groundbreaking. At the same time, it does seem to have aged well, and it's still a pretty good looking SUV, even though it's not exactly pushing the boundaries. Now, particularly here seen in machine gray metallic on gray wheels, it's not exactly the most exciting color combination. I much prefer, personally, the candy apple red color that they offer this car in, which really tends to pop. The other thing to mention too is the different trim levels. This car, of course, has chrome on the grille and the sides, on the windows, but you can get these optioned with more black chrome accents, which I think particularly look pretty good. But let me know what you think in the comments below about the looks of this generation CX-5. A big part of the reason that you're paying 40 grand as opposed to 27 grand for the base car is this engine. Now, regardless of what trim you get, you're getting a 4-cylinder 2.5 liter motor. Of course, the only difference here is this one is turbocharged where the base one is not. And this one makes quite a bit more horsepower. This is 256 horsepower and 320 pound-feet of torque. One thing to note there is that is on premium fuel. You can run non-premium fuel in this and get slightly less power. So nice to have that option. Last thing, of course, is fuel economy, 22 city, 27 highway. And I will say those are pretty honest numbers given what I've seen in the real world. Let's start first with one of the big perks of this generation CX-5, and that's the fact that the interior is really nice for the money. This actually does feel a little bit of a step up compared to that RAV4 that I was just in. That car had some real cheap pieces. The switch gear in here, the materials themselves do feel nicer. You also have this very dark brown Napa leather in here, which is really quite nice, in fact. So aside from a couple pieces of piano black that are not ideal, it is a really nicely designed and well put together interior. Outside of that, it's pretty simple in here. Of course, you have physical HVAC controls, which is very nice. They're quite low here, but you do have the option for your heated seats here in mind, but it is just operated with a button. Same thing with the heated steering wheel. The only area this really seems to fall a little bit short is the infotainment itself, because it does start to feel a bit dated in implementation. This is a touchscreen when you are parked, and that's the key thing. If you're parked and you're messing around at a stoplight or even just, in park itself, it will work. But if you're moving, you have to use this scroll wheel. And to me, that is less than ideal because it's just not that intuitive. And I spend more time looking down at the screen trying to get this cursor into the right spot than if I were to just hit a button. So I think there's a reason that a lot of these kind of combination infotainments are going away. Acura tried to do something like this, and I also feel like it wasn't super successful. So in the end, that does date the car a little bit, but you do get wireless Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, so that is pretty nice. I do like the gauge cluster. It is a combination of digital and physical, so you have this sort of physical sweeping dial, but the backlit part of the gauge itself is actually digital, so that's pretty cool. Once again, the steering wheel, nice size and shape. Overall, the seats are comfortable, although not very supportive much at all. You do have lumbar support, but pretty much zero lateral support. I will say the leather is quite soft though. The back seats, for being a pretty small SUV, are actually pretty nice. I could sit behind myself. I have just enough knee room and a decent amount of headroom. It's a pretty comfortable place. The back seats themselves also recline, so you can adjust the position. So overall, pretty successful, but just a bit dated with the way that infotainment works. Let's try and throw a bike in the back of this thing before we go out on the road for a drive. While the CX-5 competes with vehicles like the CRV and RAV4, it's important to keep in mind the CX-5 is the smallest dimensionally of the bunch. With that said, it's less of a surprise that I can't fit my 29er extra large frame mountain bike in the back. It's more to do with the width problem in the rear, simply because the opening isn't wide enough to absorb the wider handlebars. That said, my hybrid road bike fits without issue, so your mileage may vary depending on the type of bike you have. As always, if you enjoy the bike test, make sure you're hitting that subscribe button and leaving a comment below so you don't miss future videos. The Mazda CX-5 on road. The immediately apparent thing here is mostly to do with what we reference in the interior segment, where this does feel like a slightly better built vehicle on the road, and it continues with sort of just road noise. That RAV4 that I got out of, now granted it was on all-terrain tires, being that it was the TRD off-road edition, but it did have a fair amount of road noise and also wind noise. So this car, of course, being on regular tires, has less road noise, but I also really notice it from the wind noise perspective. On the highway, at highway speed, 70, 75, 80 miles an hour, it's quite a bit quieter. And it's a very windy day here. We're not going super fast, but it's surprising how well this car does insulate you from the exterior. So that is a nice feature. The other biggest thing with this car is this engine. I love this little engine. I mean, this is a fantastic piece. I can't wait to check this thing out in the hatch, the little Mazda 3 hatch. It's definitely tuned for being good at daily driving, which is obviously important for who this car is targeted for. And I say that because it doesn't make the most power up top, and it doesn't, like pull super strong all the way to redline like you would want maybe in a sports car. It's all about low down response, which is great for squirting through traffic, being able to just put your foot down and it just goes. It also doesn't seem to have to hunt for gears either. This is their 6-speed transmission, and it's way quicker to respond than that 8-speed that was in the RAV4, so I really do like that. Also, the fact that it is a traditional transmission and not a CVT is quite nice. Being that you have all this low down torque, it doesn't always have to change up a gear. Being that RAV4 had 8 gears and not a lot of power, it was constantly always looking for the appropriate gear. So this car does not have that. So big fan of the engine, big fan of the transmission in that respect. Now, the other thing that is definitely worth mentioning is this suspension. It is tuned firmer than most of the other cars in its class. Definitely more than the RAV4 and certainly more than a CRV as well. And that obviously has its pros and its cons. I think for this intended purpose of this vehicle, it might be a little firmer than this thing needs to be. And I say that because it's almost like it doesn't have a ton, the suspension doesn't have a ton of travel. It's fine for little bumps, and overall it's very acceptable, but when you hit big bumps, it is very jarring, and it almost feels like the car is hitting the bump stops very early compared to some of the other cars in the segment. Now, the trade-off of having this slightly firmer suspension is the fact that this thing handles really well and handles really flat, actually. There's not a whole ton of body roll like there traditionally would be in this category. And on this twisty road, you can kind of have a good time. It's by no means a sports car, but the steering is direct. The suspension, once again, is extremely well composed, and it really allows you to kind of have a good time. The suspension dynamics of this car are clearly something that they thought about and that they prioritized. And I appreciate that about this car, especially too, it feels smaller. It is smaller than things like the RAV4 and the CRV, but it definitely feels it on the road. This feels like a very nimble car to drive, and that's a great compliment, right? You don't want some SUV that feels lumbering. There is one caveat to that, however, and it is the steering itself. The steering is heavy. Not unbearably heavy, but way heavier than it absolutely needs to be. Basically, this is all, electric power steering now, and it's just all down to tuning. And I know that they make it heavy to try and give you a handling experience, but it doesn't need it. There's really no steering through the wheel. There's no feel of steering through the wheel. So why make it heavier than it frankly needs to be? So that is a bit of a nitpick, as is one other small nitpick when it comes to the steering. The on-center feel, particularly on the highway, is a bit darty. So in a sports car, you don't want like a numb on-center feel, meaning that when you're just driving down the highway and you're going straight, you don't want to have like a numb feeling when you make slight corrections. You want all of those to be translated through the wheel, and that's what you have here. But I don't think that's the best thing to do for a sports car, or excuse me, for an SUV. For a sports car, yes. For an SUV, no. It just feels slightly darty and a little bit wandery on the highway because it doesn't just kind of settle in on that on-center feeling. Once again, these are just minor nitpicks, but something worth calling out, definitely. Just like so you're aware of this going in. Once again, the trade-off is you're able to carve up a canyon or a mountain road like this. The brakes themselves are not very confidence-inspiring, and while the rest of the dynamics of this vehicle are quite good, I am a little bit disappointed in the brakes. There's absolutely no feedback from the brakes, and you also have to go pretty deep into the pedal to be able to get any sort of braking force. Now, that is a preference thing, and I do like a linear pedal to a certain extent, but because there is no feel here, I never really have really good confidence in these brakes. They're fine for day-to-day driving, but they do take a little bit of getting used to, which is ultimately not the end of the world. I think as we sum this thing up, one other thing that I will say that is a minor annoyance with this vehicle, if you open the rear doors, you put something in the rear seats, a lot of cars have these notifications like, hey, check your rear seats, because they're worried about people leaving their kids back there or their dog or something like that. So this will do that. Like if you open the rear door, it's going to be like, hey, check your rear seats, make sure nobody's back there, nothing's back there. Most cars will tell you that once after you've opened the rear doors and then never tell you again. This car will tell you for eternity that there is something in your back seats until you acknowledge it in this HUD cluster here. So you have to hit info, and then you have to hold down info to acknowledge that. Minor annoyance, I think it's really unnecessary. If it tells you one time to say, hey, check your rear seats, great, that's good to know, but it doesn't need to tell you perpetually forever because one time you put something in the back seats. So minor annoyance. This car overall, I think, is a great product. That's why you see a fair number of them on the road. Specifically for Mazda, this is a great seller, and it's clear that they put a lot of resources in it, even though they are a smaller company. So who is this car for? It is for somebody who does prioritize driving dynamics. I think this is a better handling car than its competitors. It does feel slightly more refined, at least compared to that RAV4. I certainly like this engine quite a bit. It makes good power. It's relatively efficient, although not the most efficient. And it's excellent for especially things like up here at elevation, where otherwise that RAV4 was just a dog going up 70. So even though this car's been around for a while, it's still I think a compelling product in the marketplace, and I'll be very curious to see where they take this in the future, being that this is due for an overall refresh or redesign, I should say, coming up very soon. So thanks to Mazda for letting me have a go in this thing, and thanks to you guys more specifically for watching it. If you made it this far, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.